Oh,
Hey,
Hello,
can you hear
Andrew.
us?
how are we going?
Good, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, good, good.
How how does it feel? Thanks for joining.
Yeah, happy
I
to.
I, sh- I should thank Amr for convincing you to, I guess.
Oh, it didn't take much convincing.
He's a nice
Yeah,
boy.
that's good. It's a good. That's good. That's something. Uh, but yeah, Andrew. Welcome to the Smooth Brain Society. So essentially, the way it goes was I was interested in asking or talking about artificial intelligence because I have no clue what it is about. And I thought, who do I know who knows anything about AI? And then all I needed to do was walk across the hallway and knock on my brother's door because he's doing a master's in artificial intelligence. So I've got him on here, and
Mhm.
he recommended that Dr. Andrew Lensen, and I need to specify doctor, um, would be one of the best people to ask to come on and talk about artificial intelligence and the ethics around it. So, Dr. Andrew Lenson, he will. I will read out his introduction, but I do not know half these words, so he will need to explain them further in a bit. But he
Sure.
has a PhD as a senior lecturer in artificial intelligence at the School of Engineering and Computer Science. His core research interests center around explainable AI, genetic programming, unsupervised learning, and real world slash interdisciplinary AI in New Zealand. So I read all these things. I have no clue what they mean. And hopefully,
Mm.
across the course of this hour, you will help me break it down. Also, on the episode is my brother, Amer Hussain. I'll let him introduce himself a little bit and what he does and what his relationship to AI is.
Hello. I'm doing a master's in AI. My research is in the use of genetic programming for multi-target regression. In other words, it is simultaneously uh, predicting specific values based on a given set of information. Um, Yeah, and more specifically using fish data. I'm looking at information we get from fish, and based on that information, assessing the level of nutrients, so assessing the level of proteins, carbs, fatty acids, and a select group of nutrients in those fish.
Awesome, cool. So, yeah, welcome, guys. Welcome, Andrew. Thanks for coming.
Okay.
Uh, can I start with a little bit of background on yourself? I gave a little bit
Yeah.
of an introduction, but I guess that does not give the full story. So could you tell us how you got into AI and what AI is?
Yeah. So I like to think of myself as an accidental academic, in that I never had grand visions of being a doctor of any kind or work in a university. But I was fortunate to have, I study here at Vic as well, so I was fortunate to have opportunities to do things like summer scholarships and then to do quite an interesting honours project. And then that sort of went sort of step by step into a master's, and then turned into a PhD. And then I sort of just stuck around because it was interesting, and then they started paying me, and so I was like, "Oh, all right, if you're going to pay me, and I guess you want me here." And so, no, I'm being slightly facetious, but I've sort of stumbled into this. I mean, I started off being interested in computer science and chemistry. That was my initial double major in my first year. Quickly realised that organic chemistry was hard, and I didn't want to do a whole paper on it, so went back
Yep.
to just computer science. And then, yeah, I mean, I've obviously done my PhD, and then did a short postdoc, and then I've been a staff member here for just over 3 years. And yeah, so really enjoying it. What is AI? That's a fun question. That's something I've been sort of trying to teach my first years this semester. And the way I like to think about it is AI is any computational system that has behavior or does things that we associate with intelligence. And so really it kind of comes back to the definition of what do you think is intelligent, right? So when something like an ATM first came out, a lot of people would say, wow, it's giving us money automatically. That's really intelligent. And so maybe back then that was kind of AI. But now we sort of take these for granted, and things like ChatGPT and self-driving cars, and sort of the barrier, what or the the level of what is and isn't AI, I think, is sort of constantly moving. And so it's a bit of a loose definition, but I would say any sort of computational system that displays intelligent behavior.
Uh, cool. But I guess because you said ATMs and stuff, there's certain things which people might have considered AIs, which probably aren't, right? So like a calculator
Hmm.
or something, because the human mind can't really calculate it that way. You'd think it's very intelligent, but a human mind can't do maths the way I guess a computer does maths or a calculator does maths. Does that kind of factor into AI as well?
Yeah, I mean, we have sort of different levels of AI, if you will. So we have things like narrow or weak AI, where we have AI that's very good at very specific tasks. So, for example, you could have an AI algorithm that can, do your tax return, and that is something that, as you sort of allude to, right, even a human can't necessarily do. You know, I can kind of do my own tax return because I'm a bit nerdy, but most people, wouldn't want to do their own tax return or need to. And so we already have situations where AI is allowing us to do things that we can't or otherwise wouldn't do. And so that idea of intelligence, I think, is more around things that we associate with experts, for example. So you could hire an accountant to do your tax return, or you could get AI tax agent 101 to do it for you. And so yeah, it's sort of a moving goalpost, I think. But it comes back to that kind of core definition of what do you think is intelligent, and it is very vague. And I think that's part of why it's become such a buzzword as well, because it's very easy to sell something as intelligent.
Very true.
Well,
Um,
yeah. So you often hear AI with the term of machine learning. Those two tend to go hand in hand. Could you elaborate a little bit on what, if there's any differences between the two, or,
Mm.
well, are they a subgroup of each other?
Yeah, yeah. So you're right. Machine learning is a very common term as well. And I think, yes, machine learning is a subcategory of AI essentially. And when we talk about machine learning, we really mean algorithms that learn from data. So you give a machine learning algorithm a big set of data, for example, the whole internet in the case of things like ChatGPT, or or a billion images in the case of some of these image recognition algorithms. You give it a bunch of data, and it will train on that data. So it takes the data and then tries to learn to give you the right answer. So if I say to you, here's 100 photos of cats and 100 photos of dogs, and then your machine learning algorithm will basically take those and one by one try and predict the right answer. And every time it gets it wrong, it will change something about um, how it operates to try and fix that mistake. So yeah, machine learning is sort of a subtype in that it's very data driven, whereas AI is a more sort of general concept and can be anything intelligent that's artificial.
cool. Because I so since AI is a subset of machine learning is a subset of AI, are there
Mm-hmm.
and machine learning is essentially using a lot of data and teaching something across time to kind of get better. What other forms are there in AI then? Why is this just a subset? What are the other things?
Yeah, yeah. So when we talk about things, for example, there's a thing in Europe called the Human Brain Project, where essentially there's a bunch of researchers had quite an ambitious goal of trying to make an artificial brain that would act very much like a human brain, but was entirely driven by computers. And so that would be a form of intelligence, in that we know obviously that our brain demonstrates intelligence. That's how we're talking here today. But that's not machine learning, because it's not about trying to predict outcomes from data. It's more about trying to recreate or simulate intelligence. And so it can be a little bit of a subtle definition sometimes, but you can think about different examples like that, where you don't necessarily have a bunch of data that you're trying to process, but you're more trying to model intelligence. And so that's something that the cognitive scientists are obviously quite interested in. And there's some people even here at Vic who are looking at whether you can do that and what they would look like.
Would you say that the few years ago Google developed that robot that could play AlphaGo, because you can't really imagine it wasn't really a process where they give them the robot a whole bunch of games and they just learn on that information. They probably learn the rules of the game, right? Would that be a form of non-machine learning AI?
Yeah, I think again, your lines get a little bit blurry. Definitions are always changing, but yeah, when Google was producing AlphaGo, which is I guess the AI model that is beating champions at Go now, they use a lot of what we call reinforcement learning, which is a type of machine learning, and that they basically simulate a whole bunch of games, and then their AlphaGo AI model tries to learn strategies to win at those games. And so it will play a game, and then at the end it will get either a reward. So, for example, I won this game in 17 turns, that's good, or maybe a penalty. I lost this game, my strategy wasn't so good. And so I think primarily they're using this idea of reinforcement learning, which is a type of machine learning, but is not quite as data driven, perhaps, as we would traditionally say, because it's not really a big database, right? It's more simulating games, playing games, and then getting feedback. So yeah, the lines do blur a little bit there.
Okay, cool. That kind of makes sense. Uh, can can I ask then, considering you said you love teaching this to first years, what is the
Yeah.
hardest part of trying to explain AI to first years?
Oh, what's the hardest part of this? Is, I mean, I don't know if there was one hardest part. I actually find it a really enjoyable challenge because our first year AI course has no programming requirements, no maths background required, and so you're really forced to try and sort of figure out the essence of these topics you're talking about and explain them in a way that does away with all the sort of technical details. And I find, things like using lots of analogies, for example, or even like demonstrations in class. Like one of my first lectures, I had a photo of my dog and a photo of ChatGPT, and I was like, okay, let's figure out which of these are intelligent and why. And so I think examples like that are really important. And so it takes quite a bit of thinking beforehand to sort of think, how would I explain this to first year Andrew who hasn't done the computer science before in a way that um, makes sense, but also doesn't trivialize it too much, because I don't want to just say, here's this fancy thing, don't worry too much about it. Like you want to give them some idea of what's going on. And so it's been a really sort of fun challenge, and it's actually forced me to understand concepts better myself as well. And so I really like that part of it is it's not just how you teach the students, but it's also clarifying those thoughts in your own mind around what are the really, what are the fundamental principles here.
Yeah, I concur because I'm tutoring the course which Andrew's running, and it's very because you have a wide variety of students coming from all
Mm.
from different majors. You can't really use a singular explanation for each of them. Some of them require other than the aspects of some being visual learners, some like to read more. It's more about the one. Say the same analogy won't fit everyone. You're gonna have to find different ways to explain this idea that um, the image, how the images are trained, or how the information is learned, how the AI model tends to improve over time. And yeah, it's quite fun actually because it just helps build my foundation on the subject as well.
Cool. So then, can I ask both of you guys, what are the key concepts? What are some of the key concepts which you would want, like someone like myself who has no experience in AI? What are the key concepts you'd first target
Mm.
if you wanted to teach?
Yeah, so I say always, it's the first time we've run the course, but I very much started the course with a discussion on what intelligence is, right? Because to me, if you're going to do a course in AI, then you should first of all have some idea what intelligence is, because otherwise, how do you know what artificial intelligence is? And so some of the discussion we've already had today, I think, is a big part of that. And then from there, we go into quite a lot of fundamentals around machine learning. And I think that is because it is really sort of the center or the beating heart of AI today. So when we see things like ChatGPT. We see sort of these text to image things like DALL-E 2 and DALL-E 3 and Midjourney. These image generation tools. They're all using generative AI, and that at its heart is using machine learning. So if you want to understand modern AI, so to speak, you need to know machine learning. And so within concepts, even just concepts like, what does data look like? What is this idea of tabular data versus text data versus image data? What does it mean to have a data that is labeled versus unlabeled? So, for example, I said before the examples of cats and dogs, right? So if I give you photos of cats and photos of dogs, and I tell you these are the cats and these are the dogs, that allows you to do what we call supervised learning. So you can use those labels to tell your algorithm whether or not it's giving you the right answers. Whereas if you don't have those labels, you have to do a thing called unsupervised learning, which is a whole different type of approach. And so I think these fundamental ideas can get you quite a long way in terms of understanding what is being used out there, and I think can be quite empowering because you can kind of go, yeah, I can kind of see how ChatGPT came to be, and for first years, that's quite a cool thing, right? I mean, it's not necessarily what they would expect coming in, and so we really try and focus on giving them those tools to understand the overall principles, and then obviously at second and third year you can get more into the technical details. But Amer, what about you? What have I missed?
Well, not much really. I think you covered all the basic bases there. Um, that actually, one of the words you mentioned that actually leads up nicely into some of your research, which is unsupervised learning.
Mm.
Um, I think it might be a good good little concept to discuss because that's actually something we see quite often day to day on the internet. Um, could you explain to us a bit more on your research in unsupervised learning, and but first, what unsupervised learning is?
Yeah, for sure. So when we say unsupervised learning, that is essentially when we have data that has no labels. So, yeah, I mean, for example, if I give you an example of your Netflix viewing history. So I know that Amir, you've been watching Treasure Island for the last couple of weeks, and I can see you've been watching it every night for 2 or 3 hours a night. I can sort of build up this profile. This
Misinformation right there.
misinformation. I said on a podcast, it must be true. Um, yeah,
Of
so
course,
I can build
of
up
course.
this sort of I have some data. Maybe it doesn't represent Amir's viewing history. Maybe it's someone else's, or whatever our data is. But the point is, there's no labels about it. So I don't know, what exactly I want my AI or my machine learning algorithm to predict, or what the output should be. So, if we talk about to contrast that, something like if I said I want to predict house prices, then we know how many bedrooms a house has, how many bathrooms it has, where its location is, and we know what it last sold for, and so we could build a model to try and predict the price based on that. Whereas for unlabeled or unsupervised learning, we don't have any of those labels, and so what we're doing there is things like trying to recommend Amir his next show to watch based on what other people like him have been watching. So if he's been watching Treasure Island a whole bunch, then maybe he would like to also watch, Keeping Up with the Kardashians next. Like because we know that people who watch Treasure Island often will watch Keeping Up with the Kardashians,
Yeah.
and so that would be a form of unsupervised learning because we're not saying this is this is a label of we're not saying Amir is this type of person, this is a label, but we're saying what do other people like and what are their behaviors, and so that would be something like a recommender system, and that's actually a lot of what places like Facebook, um, Meta more generally, and Google and Twitter, or X I suppose is now, are doing, right?
Yeah.
They're looking at what people like what their behavior is, and then using that to help suggest things to you. Um, yeah.
So it's just kind of pattern recognition in a way, just being like, oh,
Yeah.
if people do this and this and this, then they should, in theory, do this kind of thing.
Yeah, pretty much. You're trying to find pattern within that data, right? Because you don't have any labels, and so what you want to know is how is this data represented? What's the structure of it? And so another form of unsupervised learning, and one that I did some work on in my PhD was around clustering. So if I say, here is my data set of, I don't know, 10,000 people, I can, for example, cluster or group them into maybe say 3 or 5 or 10 clusters, and then the people within each of those clusters are all sort of related to each other as far as data sets go, whereas people in different clusters are unrelated. And so something like that is used quite often in things like marketing. So if Amazon can group, people together who have similar purchase histories, then they can maybe make an ad campaign just for that group of people. And so, yeah, this idea of trying to find patterns or structure in your data.
Cool. So, but with clustering and all, you need to start off with some data points to begin with, right? So you can't start this out of nothing. So I'm assuming your algorithms get stronger the more data you put in all these. What do you say? Yeah, in all these types of AI, you need to start off with something to create more. But then from that point, is there an issue with the data you use itself? So, for example, you said using people's search histories or whatever. Is there an issue with using that information without someone actually giving it to you?
Oh, totally. I mean, the data privacy is sort of is an incredibly contentious issue, and I think this year more than anything, with the disputes we're seeing in Hollywood and the disputes we're seeing even more generally in sort of in the art community, right? So things like ChatGPT that have been trained on basically the internet. There's a lot of questions there about, hang on, have they asked permission to use this data? If you write a blog post or if you host a podcast, do you mind if OpenAI or Google or whoever it is using that data to train their model? Should they be asking for permission? Should they be giving you some money to do that? It's a massive legal question and also a massive ethical question. Legally speaking, it's looking like maybe they might not have to, because it's not a copyright issue necessarily, because they're not copying, they're sort of learning from it. But there's a lot of lawsuits going on, especially in the US around that at the moment, especially in Hollywood. And then sort of ethically speaking, it's a much more subtle question, because some people will say, I posted this online, I don't expect to I put it out there for people to read and to use however they want. I don't expect anything back. Now, people say, well, hang on, no, I posted this for humans to read, and this is, a piece of creative writing. Maybe it's my poetry. I don't want someone else taking that and then sort of stealing my creativity and then using it for their own good. And so there's a very big question here, and depending on who you talk to, you'll get very different perspectives as well.
Do you think do you think the stuff produced by AI then is original, like stuff produced from ChatGPT, or is it just, in your opinion, do you think it's original, or do you think it's just like regurgitated work in a different way?
So it's original. It's often original in the sense that it has never existed before. So if ChatGPT generates a 200-word paragraph, probably that's never been written before. Sometimes it might have been, but most of the time it hasn't been. So it's original in that sense. But is it? And so I guess technically it's original, but again, it comes back to definition, right? What is originality? And I think there's very much a question like, what is creativity? And I like to think about it sometimes that when you write something, if I tell you to write a 200-word paragraph on, I don't know, your opinions on Game of Thrones, for example, right?
Oh yeah, I can write a lot on that.
Yeah. So only 200 words. When you write that, you're not writing it just from some inherent pre-existing knowledge in your brain. You've read things about Game of Thrones. You've watched the movies. You've probably read some blog posts or some synopses. You have all this information that you've yourself as a human sort of trained on. And so when you write it, are you writing an original piece of work, or have you just sort of trained on someone else's? And and so that's quite an interesting, I think, um, discussion to have sometimes. Of course, there's a difference in scale because how fast you learn and how you learn is very different to things like ChatGPT. But if you sort of follow that argument, then you can see how, especially legally speaking, how some of these things are quite
Get
grey
buggy,
areas.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No, that's
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting it's definitely an interesting question because to my understanding of how ChatGPT works,
Hmm.
um, it just sort of uses the words and sentence structures that it knows, and on a probabilistic scale of words which associate with it, it just sort of forms sentences based on appropriate grammar structures, based on appropriate sentence structures. So how is that far off from how we as humans use words in a language? Because we tend not to use words we don't know. We use words which we already know, and
Hmm.
more often than not, use them in in the sentence structure or context that are most applicable. And ChatGPT sort of operates on a similar sort of dynamic, uh, where because it's sort of because of the way it works, it won't always have the same sentence. If you ask it a question, it can quite often have formed that sentence in different ways because it has a small element of randomness to it, which allows it to exert that um, generative quality or that creativity aspect of it.
Yeah. So ChatGPT and humans, I guess, you can get very similar results in some ways. So, I mean, one of the reasons ChatGPT is so successful is because it kind of passes that test of this looks like a human could have written it. I mean, myself having used ChatGPT a bunch now, I can kind of tell when it's written by ChatGPT because it's very waffly and it uses certain disclaimers at the end, and it has a very sort of banal sort of writing style to it.
yeah,
But that being said, it sort of passes that test of it looks human. But uh, it's interesting because it uses a very different approach to what we do, right? So ChatGPT and models like it are basically just predicting the next word. And so every time it spits out a word, it's going, okay, what are the previous words? What have we said before? And then that all goes into its big network and it says, okay, here is the next word. And as Amir said, that is sort of slightly random. So it will have maybe the top 10 words and then it will pick one of those with some amount of randomness, which makes it seem more creative or more human like. Whereas when we write things down, we don't, well, at least I hope, we don't necessarily sit down and go, okay, what is the next word in the sentence? If we wrote like that, it would be a very weird result you'd get. It's like that sort of game you can play with your kids where you're trying to make a sentence and you each have to choose one word at a time that ends up being, talking about butts and rainbows and all sorts of things, right?
yeah.
And so as humans, we tend to be much better at doing things like abstraction. So we start off with some high level idea or concept, and then we break it down into smaller parts. And each of those parts, we then figure out how are we going to say this, and then how do we structure that, and where it fits into our writing. So we almost go the opposite way. We start off quite high level and work our way down, whereas ChatGPT is just sort of going along one word at a time. Um, but I mean, it's kind of a means to an end in that you get a very similar outcome, or at least an outcome from ChatGPT that is good enough to do a lot of the things that we do when we write.
Yeah. Uh, Considering, well, I guess, yeah, you said means to an end, but are there any models which you know of or AI models which you're working with which do it the same way humans do, like go from top to bottom, or is that not really possible?
Yeah, there certainly is quite a lot of research using more of that sort of approach where you start off with concepts and then try and break them down to sub concepts, and that's in some ways that's almost more one of these examples of AI rather than machine learning, perhaps, because this idea of, for example, learning ontologies or learning hierarchies and all these sort of things that we know humans do, or even scientists do, obviously. are things you can also get computers to do. Um, but by and large, a lot of the recent progress has been on these more sort of iterative next word approaches for language models. It happens that that's the approach that has worked really well, and so now this is the approach everyone sort of jumped on the bandwagon of because it's new and exciting and successful. But that's not to say that these other approaches aren't able to give us sort of more more representative forms of intelligence that perhaps might eventually align more of how we as humans think.
Interesting. Um, should we like move forward to I listed out a list of things in your introduction. Could we like go through them and we talk about each one a little bit? So
Sure.
the first thing which I said was explainable AI.
Mm.
What is explainable AI? You've been explaining AI to me, but I assume if the term is there, it means something different.
Yeah, so often when we talk about modern AI, we're talking about, as I said, we talked a lot about things like ChatGPT, for example, and the models driving ChatGPT are just absolutely enormous. So we're talking about something that has 1.7 billion numbers in it, and each of those numbers will be some real valued number. So maybe it's 4.973 or whatever it is, and you have 1.7 billion of those. And when it gives you an output, it's basically doing a big calculation using all those numbers. Um, and so what that means is you really have no idea what it's actually doing inside, right? If I put something into one of these models and it gives me an output, I can say, oh, that's a nice output, but I don't know how it got to that output. I mean, I can maybe have some intuition based on how it was designed, or I can do some very high level analysis, but most of the time I have very little idea. And so explainable AI, on the other hand, is much more focused about, okay, how do we make these models that we can understand? So if I put in your details for a bank loan and the model says, no, no bank loan for you, I mean, you want to know why that is. You want to know what a decision is. And so if you use something like an explainable AI system, then maybe it can say, oh, your bank loan was denied because your income was below this threshold, or you don't have a high enough deposit, rather than just saying, no loan for you.
Yeah. Hmm.
Nice sort of analogy I like to use when it comes to these two types of AI. So regular AI, so black box AI versus explainable AI is a black box model would be something along the lines of you see a cow going into a beef jerky factory, and the next thing you have is beef jerky. You do not know what happens inside the factory. And
Mm.
I'm pretty sure not many people would want to know what's going on in that factory for that beef jerky to come out. So explainable AI is just sort of a doorway into the factory to just have a look at what exactly is going on, as grotesque as it might be. Uh, yeah, so that's sort of the analogy I tend to use when trying to
Mm.
explain why what the current AI does and why explainable AI is important.
It's a good one.
It's a good one. It's great for a vegan documentary as well. Uh, but okay, so if we're doing that, is is there a sort of apart from the benefit of like seeing what's going on,
Mm.
are there other benefits to it as well? Can you alter what's happening inside then because of it, if versus the black box where you don't know what's going on at all?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really salient point, right? And so there's almost a scientific discovery point to it as well, right? So if you want to make a really good model, and you can't really understand what it's doing inside, then it's much harder to try and improve it or to make it more accurate or those sort of things. And so from sort of a scientific perspective, it's a very appealing to have models where you can go inside and go, oh, look, it's obviously done this thing wrong. How can I change my algorithm to try and fix that? And so I do a lot of work with, for example, people in ecology and in law and other disciplines. And if I give them some massive black box model that gives very accurate results, they'll go, oh, that's nice. Good job, Andrew. but they won't really trust it, and they won't really want to use it because they don't. I mean, first of all, they can't validate what it's doing, and second of all, as an ecologist, you're not interested just in getting the best results. You want to
result.
know why you get those results. And so, explainable AI as a sort of a research tool, I think, is also a really interesting and often underlooked benefit. And so, yeah, it's a good one to bring up too.
Hmm.
A
Um,
nice sort of sorry to interrupt, but there's a nice sort of dichotomy because the current
Mm,
project I am doing, or I'm doing my research for, is composed of three different teams. So Vic has the AI team, you have a biochem team, and
mm,
a team from the uh, pisciculture industry, the one with fish. Yep. Um, so and we asked both parties, well, what do they prefer? Do they prefer the models to be explainable, or would they rather just good results? And you had the biochem team who were very curious as to know what's going on in the model, and they had a vehement yes, while as the industry people just said, "Oh, we don't care. We just want good results, and if something goes wrong, we will point to you."
yeah.
Because that's how the industry works. They just want the results because they don't really care what's going on inside. So just sort of finding the balance between different AI current AI techniques tend to range from having being very explainable to
Mm,
and not being as good to stuff like deep learning, which uses ChatGPT, which ChatGPT uses, which as Andrew explained earlier, billions of parameters and very tough to understand what's going on in there, but will give you very good results.
so, um, because of that, is not knowing a kind of concern that the AIs will become sentient or they can't make their own code. They just follow whatever code you tell them. And we're getting into sci-fi part now. Uh,
it was bound to happen.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think of that as sort of a direct outcome of explainable AI in terms of necessarily having an effect on whether or not things become sentient. I think that's more of a wider discussion around. Um, I mean, there's still a very open question there about whether or not it is possible for these models to become sentient. And I hate to do this again, but again, it's going to come back to your definition of sentience, because we all know that even philosophers and psychologists will debate all day around what sentience actually means. I'm sure this is something you've
Yep. Yeah.
found in your area, right?
Hmm.
And I think what people are really concerned about is having uh, these sort of AI models that are in the real world and are able to do things better than anyone else, or to um, basically take over the world, right? So the big sort of scary thing is we'll accidentally create some AI system and it will escape from the lab or whatever it is and run around the world and kill everyone and take over, and that's the end of humankind. Um, I don't think we're anywhere near that point. And you could debate all day around whether it's even possible to get to that point. And so I tend to, and this is sort of an easy out for me, but I tend to focus a lot more on more immediate threats around things like, data privacy, data sovereignty, what the sort of social benefits versus risks of these algorithms are, right? Because I think if we can have a debate around, AI replacing jobs, or AI being used in ways that will make existing inequities worse, then we're sort of starting that discussion that will needs to be had before we even start talking about sentience. Because
Yeah.
when we decide what we want AI to do in our society, I think we'll probably find actually no, we don't want to create these sentient models. And so then we will need to talk about things like regulations and other ways to try and prevent that from happening. Again, not that I think it's a sure thing that it will happen, but it tends to be better to prepare for the very unlikely worst case rather than sort of go, it'll probably be fine.
Yeah. I This reminds me of I think there was a news article a couple years ago where some scientists had discovered how to how to create an embryo from dinosaur bones or
Mm.
from dinosaur DNA, and the first comment under it was this specifically four movies telling us why this is a bad idea.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, mm, um, yeah, a bit similar. Can we then talk about your work around data privacy and security and all those issues? Because I think that's very interesting. So, yeah, kind of what do you do around it? Yeah, let's just see where you go. Freeform.
Yeah, so I haven't done that much direct on a data privacy part of it, but I am quite interested in using things like Explainable AI as a tool for understanding how decisions are made with people's data, if that makes sense. Um, and so when we see, central government, for example, are very interested in using AI to make their processes more efficient and to sort of automate things. I mean, we know that ACC has a really big use of predictive modeling, or excuse me, or AI, where if you go to a doctor for a reasonably normal injury, like you cut your leg on the trampoline or something, you'll often get a text before you leave a doctor's office saying, "Yep, your claim's been approved," and that's a predictive model, an AI system that is making that decision. And so to me, the interesting question is then how can we understand how it made that decision? And I think that itself is a data privacy or just a data sovereignty even issue, right? Because if there's a system using your data, you want to know, well, you may want to know what data it's using, and as we said before, how it's using it to reach that decision. And so if you get denied, then can it tell you why you don't get your ACC claim? Um, for Cloudy, ACC only uses it to sort of do fast approvals, and so if there's something that wouldn't get approved by that system, it goes to a human for manual review. And so they have a safeguard there, but even there's perhaps a bias in that if you don't get a fast approval, maybe you're less likely to get approved in the long run. And so um, yeah, I've gone on a bit of a tangent here, but to me, I guess that's the interesting part is how we can build these systems that are trustworthy, especially in these more governmental applications where the government has a duty to do right by their citizens. If a company is using your data that you've given them in a way you're not happy with, I mean, you can kind of stop using their product. But if the government's doing it, it's a bit harder to opt out of that sort of system.
Sorry, Andrew, there's a bit of a tangent, but
Mm,
your ACC example
mm,
sort of brought up this question for me. How would you differentiate? Because I imagine most of the modeling which government agencies do would be
mm,
statistics based, statistical modeling.
mm.
How would you differentiate between statistical modeling and AI modeling?
Yeah, so I think it's sort of a natural evolution of what government's already doing. So I mean, I feel like government was one of the first places to start to use things like business rules, sort of if-then statements. If, for example, use an ACC example, if your injury is less than $200 a risk, approve it. Like that sort of statistical modelling, and it's quite natural that they're going to take that modelling and then, I mean, probably very slowly because it's government, very slowly evolve it into more machine learning or I shouldn't throw shade at government. They're very hardworking people. Um, more sort of advanced or more modern AI approaches. And so a lot of these concerns that we're talking about are ones that have been around for quite a while. But I think it's just that um, modern AI is we know is much more highly performing and can operate much more quickly and at scale, and is also inherently more of a black box. So a statistical model or a sort of a business rule model where you can look at the rules versus a neural network model where it's learned some rules but you can't see them. And so I think we're just seeing these concerns sort of grow in significance these days.
Do you, do you think with because you said well with a private company it just don't provide to the private company, do you think governments and all need to get slightly involved? Because a lot of private companies I feel they're well really big, and in many ways you kind of need them these days for
Yeah.
communications and so on and so forth. So how, as someone who works in AI, do you recommend countering?
Yeah, for sure. I think uh, we definitely need stronger legislation, particularly around data. I mean, we have a Privacy Act that is almost up to date with the internet, not quite. They've almost got up to date with the internet, and that was a few years ago, right? And so our privacy laws are actually pretty good compared to a lot of the world, but are still quite behind where they ideally would be. And so, yes, I think there is a lot of work to be done in that space. For example, do you have a right to, well, I mean, actually, the Privacy Act, as it stands, says that you have a right to know how your data is used, but I don't know how well that's been tested in terms of can you demand an explanation of how this AI model used your data? And if you ask the government that in a Official Information Act request or something, I don't quite know how they'll respond to that, because if they're using one of these neural network models, they might not be able to explain it. And so I think there's a lot of questions there and a lot of work to be done in terms of modernizing the legislation. And I guess another angle to it is that we know these AI models, especially these very big ones, are from overseas companies, so places primarily the US and Europe a little bit as well. And so when we think about AI being used in New Zealand, there's lots of questions for government around how do we make sure these companies aren't just profiting off our data? How do we make sure these AI systems are designed for New Zealand? So a Western model trained in the US is probably not very aware of Māori data sovereignty or tikanga. And so there's a lot of work to be done in that space as well, because it's here already, right? And the impact is going to keep growing. And so I would like to see more sort of discourse in that area, and then hopefully after the election we'll start to see an AI strategy or something coming out.
Well, yeah, I guess after Trump's election, you saw the Space Force come out, so hopefully.
Yeah.
So, sorry, as your fellow lecturer for the AI Level 100 course, Ali, he present. I believe he mentioned something along the lines of, in terms of where AI is in regards to research, that we're probably in a stage similar to that of the Renaissance, where science and tech was developed. So if we use that sort of analogy and say that AI is currently at that sort of standpoint of what 16, 1700s, how do you think that should develop? How do you think that should play a role in the molding of these legislations, and make sure we sort of future-proof them better than previous laws and bills for, say, the internet or cybersecurity?
Yeah, writing law is really hard. Um, and we've seen a lot of examples where law has been sort of rushed through in reactions to certain events, and then ends up being very lacking or needs a lot of further work. And so to me, I guess my approach would be to look more at those very fundamental um, aspects of things like data as a human right. And so if you think about it from that angle, you can sort of make a set of laws that is more likely to be effective for a longer period of time. If I say, all right, any algorithm used in New Zealand on someone's personal data, I guess you have to define personal data, right? But maybe on things like age, ethnicity, gender, those sort of things. Any algorithm that uses that data has to be able to explain to that person how it was used and how the outcome was produced. You could tidy it up a little bit, but if you had a piece of law like that, then that is will work not only for AI but also for these other more statistical models or business rule models that we see already. And so I would hope and I would expect that it would work for a longer period of time. So this rather than have a law saying, okay, ChatGPT is bad and they have to pay us this much money, which in a year or two probably not really as relevant anymore. It's
Yeah.
more about those underlying principles almost like human rights.
Yeah. The one on the same lines, then you did mention a little bit about one of the biggest fears being into the workforce, or how AI might lead to further inequalities. We
Mm.
saw it a little bit, or we're seeing it a little bit with the writer's strike and so on in Hollywood right now. What do you? How much of a threat do you think AI in its current form is, and do you need specific laws to prevent from this in the future as well?
Yeah, it's a really tough question. Um, in some ways, I would have expected more disruption to happen by now. I mean, when ChatGPT was sort of released almost a year ago now, it was pretty obvious that this technology could do a lot of things that, to a reasonable level, that existing jobs were doing. So things like people running blogs and people in marketing, even social media posts. A lot of that could be automated. Um, and I'm kind of surprised, but but definitely sort of glad that it hasn't been as quick of a transition as I expected, and that we still have people in these jobs,
Hmm.
um, and in some sense, you need those people to sort of validate and fine tune these models and make sure they're getting the right output. But that being said, I do expect, especially those sort of jobs, to change significantly in the next few years still. I think companies are already working on how to integrate this technology into their sort of pipelines or into their processes. And the more and more that happens, the more we'll see fewer of these roles available, and it'll be less around people, writing marketing posts or social media posts, and more around many fewer people validating those posts or tweaking those posts. And so to me, there is certainly a concern here in that uh, there could be a lot of this transition could be very fast, and that could be quite scary. Um, People like to talk about the Industrial Revolution as sort of an analogy, but the Industrial Revolution happened over a much longer period of time because building factories takes quite a lot of time because you have to physically build them, right? Whereas
Yeah.
using AI, you just have to download a model, get someone to write a bit of code, stick some things together, and then you got something working. And so um, when people talk about things like universal basic income, I think this is perhaps another example of why something like that is a good idea. Because if we don't know exactly where this technology is going in the next 5 years, and then having more social security and these sort of these things in place in case we need them
Yeah.
is a much safer approach than saying we'll see what happens. It'll probably be fine.
Hmm. Um, yeah. What do you say to people? So I've got friends who work in, the creativity,
Yeah.
kind of that, like advertising and so on, and
Mm.
what do you say to people who are like, who one are pretty mad at ChatGPT and
Yeah.
various AI models? ChatGPT is obviously the most common one, and for them also saying that it cannot actually replace true artists or true art.
Yeah, I mean, I would be mad as well, and I kind of am mad because I don't think we've seen our government or even society more generally sticking up for these people, right? So we, as a society, we've always sort of undervalued the creative field, and I mean, I think that's
Mhm.
because we get a bit political here, but it's because we're built on capitalism, right? And so we're driven by profit, and so things like uh, the creative industries that sort of have to scrape by, and we don't see
Mhm.
the support for them that they probably really deserve. Um, and so, yeah, what are these people going to do if they are losing work to things like ChatGPT or to image generation tools? And it's not to say that these tools are better than them. By no means they are. I mean, the creative industry is still much better at communicating to people, understanding what they want, and then building something that's actually has a human element to it. And
Yeah.
so I think there's always going to be a role for that, much like there's still a role for painting, even though we have photography. But it's going to be smaller because if you want a stock photo for your social media post, or if you want a blog post releasing your new software or your new product, companies are going to choose the large language model that costs a few dollars rather than the creative professional who costs, it's maybe a 50, 100, $150, right? Um, and so what is my message to them? I mean, I don't want to have to tell them to retrain or get another job because I don't think that's what they should have to do. But I
Yeah.
can't help but be confronted by the fact that it is going to be a smaller workforce and it's going to be even more competitive, and that it's just kind of a depressing thing.
Mm.
And I think really raises bigger questions about how we as a society value people and value
Yeah.
their contributions. Yeah.
To the just sort of on the creative on that creativity aspect. If you, I imagine, well, I'm not an expert in the arts, but um, the stark differences from the lens of an artist
Mm,
between classical pieces of art against modern art
mm,
uh, are significant. Uh, and if from my perspective, if I trained, say, something akin to ChatGPT, but for art form on images pre, say, 1600s, no matter how creative it is, it probably would never be able to come up with something the modern art movement came up with,
mm,
which is quite different.
mm,
It would be able to make plenty of pieces which are inspired by those art pieces from that period, but not be able to make something completely new. So one aspect could, or you could look, one way to look at it could be that it could also breed some new evolution in the creative world of doing something new, and but at the same time, uh, it is, as Andrew said, a very sort of difficult period, and it, there's no sort of guarantee of how this all will play out.
yeah, I think there's always going to be a role for artists because there's always going to be a desire to have art that is driven by human experience and human emotion. And you see when you look at artwork, you talk about artwork from the 1600s, and you learn about what the creator was going through in their life at that time and how their sort of mental disorder linked to this creative art stuff. They have all these human elements to it. But I think the economic value of things like digital art, and for example, are going to suffer because it's just so easy to automate it that companies who just want a pretty picture for their press release, they're not going to see that value financially speaking. And I think that is where the impact on jobs and impact on careers is going to is going to be an issue in terms of it as a hobby and and even for some artists to actually still be very famous artists and be very successful artists. That's not going away, but it's that sort of that bulk of the creative work, the sort of contracted work.
This it's a bitty. It sounds like a, I won't say a grim, but it sounds like a sad picture until like legislation and all is done, and as a society we kind of change our priorities a little bit. So Kit, let's move on to something slightly nicer. You
Sure.
in your bio you say you have a number of collaborations under AI for good.
Mm.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the good parts
Yeah,
of
yeah.
AI now to kind of finish. So what are part of these collaborations?
Yeah, so I think one of the really nice things about working at a university is I get the opportunity to sort of set my own research agenda, right? To some extent. If I start doing, jazz piano or something, they might like pull me up for it. But if as long as I'm doing something to do with AI, I can sort of do what I want. Um, and I try and take advantage of that and try and sort of explore ways that we can use this technology to actually improve issues in our society. And so AI for Good being sort of a movement, it's an older movement now that is around how do we use this in a way that is more or less for good purposes. And so one of my favorite collaborations is with Dr. Rachel Shaw in the School of Ecology. And her and I are working on using AI to automatically identify individual kaka at Zealandia. So if I put a camera in a nest box and Bob the kaka comes along, I take a photo of him, and I can say, oh look, that's Bob. I've seen him before 5 days ago in Wilton's bush, and now I know that Bob's gone from Wilton to Zealandia. And so you learn a whole bunch of things, for example, around their sort of nesting patterns, around whether or not they commute, because apparently birds commute to and from Zealandia. I guess it makes sense, right? You have a nest set up there.
Yeah.
And even things like population dynamics. So do the same birds hang out together? And things like how much the bird's appearance changes over time. So there's a whole bunch of questions we can answer here that without this technology would be pretty much impossible to answer, because kaka, in Wellington at least, are so prevalent now that they are mostly unbanded. So it used to be that when a kaka was born, usually at Zealandia, researchers put a series of colour bands on their legs, and then you would be able to identify them based on those bands. But now that there's so many of them, the majority of them don't have those bands. And even if they did, the amount of work it takes to have usually a semi-gullible postgraduate student sitting in the field looking at the bands and writing them down, it's quite expensive.
Right.
And so this technology would allow us to basically find out a whole bunch more information and to tackle things like some of the issues we've seen recently where kaka are starting to try and feed out of bait stations. So poison stations, kaka are very curious and they like to try and stick their heads in, and that can end very badly. And if we can understand if it's the same birds or if it's certain locations, there's all this information we can gather that would lead to a lot of really interesting ecological findings and also conservation advantages. So that's just sort of one of the examples of things that I work on, which I think it's pretty hard to find some bad part to. I mean, yeah, maybe we don't have as many students sitting in the field, but then hopefully those students can spend more time analyzing data and looking at results and find interesting
Yeah.
behaviors, but that sort of thing.
The hardest, sorry, what would be the hardest part of this process? Would it be the data collection or would it be applying of the AI method?
It's definitely applying it, because so this whole research direction is based on um, hypothesis is the wrong word because we have confirmed it to some extent, um, but we believe that kaka have quite distinctive beaks because they are parrots, and when you look at their beaks, you can see quite um, sometimes reasonably subtle, but certainly differences in things like beak textures, the shape of the beak, the angles of the beak, all of these things. And so we know that kaka look different, but what we don't know is, for example, how different they look. So is it minor variations? Is it always big variations? And even things like, do their beaks look the same every single year? So if I look at a bird now and a bird in 5 years, will its beak be the same or will it have changed completely? And so we know that we can distinguish them, for example, within maybe a single season, so maybe one summer, but we don't yet know, can we do that every summer? And sort of counterintuitively, the more and more birds that we get pictures of, kind of the harder and harder it will get because there are more and more beaks and they are more likely to start to be more similar. And so there's a big question there about how do we actually use this technology to detect different birds very accurately. And so I think this is another really good example of where using AI for an interdisciplinary application then raises new computer science or new AI challenges. And so even though we're applying it to this area, there's this whole question of how do we then change our network or change our model to be more accurate on this type of data. And so you can learn also quite a lot of fundamental machine learning or do fundamental machine learning research at the same time.
That was just very well explained, and also I think my head just went a bit expanded quite a bit. So I'm trying to think of what to ask next. Uh, So I am assuming that because what you're doing with Kaka, you can essentially do it with any bird or any animal, whatever, if you set it up, and um, yeah, you could kind of repeat the processes per se.
It depends a little bit. we think it would apply to other parrots. So, for example, the kea, the mountain parrot in New Zealand, is quite similar to kako in that regard. Um, a lot of there's actually not that much research in this area. A lot of people do it on things like giraffes, who obviously have quite distinctive stripes, or elephants, or a lot going on in Africa with African animals. I think researchers want to go to Africa, so they do it on African animals.
Mhm.
But other animals, like I don't, it would be like a blackbird. Could you do it on a blackbird? Maybe, but then I don't know. Whenever I've looked at a blackbird, they all look pretty similar, and maybe that's me being specious, but we do need to have these sort of visual differences in order for the machine learning to find them, right? And so if
Yeah.
you or I can't tell the difference between them, then it's going to be quite hard, or it's going to be harder for a model to do
Machine.
that. Yeah.
Ooh, that's really cool. I, that's pretty interesting. Um, yeah. So, do you, in that case, how would you? That's this is probably the last kind of question I would ask because we are
Mm,
also recorded for about an hour and a bit.
mm,
How would you then, for like a blackbird, you said, which is pretty hard to see, or for things
mm.
where human vision or whatever cannot identify it, therefore making a model of it is really hard. How would you
Mm.
create models for those things? What would be the step to, yeah.
Yeah, so you'd have to look at other approaches. And so one of the really sort of classic approaches in ecology is to use things like pit tags, which are basically little tags that are attached to animals that emit basically a radio frequency that identifies them. Um, Again, you run into all those same problems of scale, and if you have lots of birds, you can't possibly tag them all. One of my colleagues, Stephen Marsland, in the School of Maths, is actually looking at using audio recordings to try and identify kiwi, because kiwi have very distinctive songs, right? They Part of the reason that they are able to pair up for life, so a male and female kiwi will tend to have a heterosexual what's the word when they have
Mm,
the same partner,
monogamous. Yeah.
monogamous. I don't know. I don't actually know about the sexuality of kiwi. Haven't learned that one yet, but yeah, they will tend to pair for life, or at least for a long period of time. And part of the reason that they do that is because they recognize each other's calls, and you often hear them calling to each other in the night. And so, based on that, we can perhaps identify kiwi based on their audio recordings. And so you can look at other types of data. So rather than looking at photos of kiwi, which is probably hard because they're nocturnal, you can look at their audio recordings, and then maybe that will give you information to make these algorithms. And so you have to sort of think about you're basically trying to think about what is the thing that I or an expert can use to identify these animals, and based on that, it tells you perhaps where you should start using machine learning.
Awesome. Uh, I I know I know we've been recording for about an hour and a bit, and I really did want to get into genetic programming and all the other stuff, but
All good.
we'll probably let it be even for like listener
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
ease. We'll have you on another time to talk about all the other stuff. Hopefully post election and see if something new's come out. Uh, but I'll ask you, what are the next steps in terms of what your research is looking at? What are your goals? Where do you see yourself going with AI?
Yeah, so I'm really keen to sort of scale up some of this interdisciplinary research. So I mentioned the AI and ecology one, but there's also some stuff in AI and law I'm quite interested in, around using things like ChatGPT or large language models to help with access to justice, giving people sort of legal recommendations or resources they can look at. And so for me, I'm really trying to scale up those collaborations. And I mean, part of that is finding good students, and part of that is also finding money. And so I'm in that kind of stage of having to write grants and say, please, look, we're doing cool stuff, give us some money. Um, but of course, also the explainable AI is always a part of that as well. So I tend to choose collaborations that are interesting to me, and they tend to be ones where I want to understand more about the model and the data and the problem. And so, even in our Kaka research, we're looking at explainable models because, as I said towards the start, my ecologist collaborator is not going to trust me or trust a model if she can't understand it to some extent. And I'm kind of like that too. I don't want to trust some black box model. And so being able to take, I guess, all these different interests they have and combine them into research projects is, yeah, it's really fun and exciting. And so I just sort of hope to keep going and hope to take these things to that next level where they can have more of an impact on New Zealand, or could it be more used more in practice?
On the interdisciplinary applications aspect,
Mm,
um, what do you think would be sort of what do you think would be easier, as because as of right now, where if there is a discipline that wants to apply AI tools, it's usually up to the person with the AI background to get caught up to speed with the discipline.
mm,
And as far as, well, I'm quite new in terms of using AI for interdisciplinary
mm,
applications, uh, but it just sort of feels like the AI people have to increase their brain folds uh, and just sort of get a better gauge of the domain they're trying to apply the AI
mm.
tool in, as opposed to the people of the party from the other discipline understanding an equivalent amount of AI. So, how much more of a role do you think the collaborating disciplines should play in sort of developing the AI tool?
Yeah, yeah. One of the things I've really quite enjoyed is that my Rachel, my collaborator in ecology, has learnt so much about AI just through our collaborations that these days, sometimes when we meet with a student, she can be like, no, 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 your model seems to be overfitted. Have you tried this or something? I'm sitting there like, am I even needed anymore? And so I really like this stuff because both parties hopefully are learning something. And again, one of the nice things about being in academia is you never really stop learning. Um, and for a while, that's kind of frustrating because you're like, I don't want to be a student forever. But then when you realize it can be fun as well and you can become a bit of an ecologist or a bit of a lawyer, I think that can be really empowering. Um, but I mean, and here's a little plug for you, but we've got a new AI major at Vic, right? And one of the things I really tell students interested in that is don't do just AI, do AI and something else because all of the sort of jobs and interesting problems in AI going forward are going to be much more around how you use it for particular problems or particular applications. And so if you can have some expertise in both, that's really, really ideal. Or even if you're doing a psychology major or whatever, a health science major, you can do a minor in AI or just do a first year AI paper. It's 15 points. It should be interesting, and that can give you enough of fundamental sort of baseline knowledge that you can then have these conversations with people in AI, and then you're, as Amir said, you're sort of meeting them halfway a little bit.
So
Uh,
essentially, you suggest that we keep them in the dark and preserve our jobs.
For now, maybe, yeah. I don't think it will work in the long term.
good. I'll clip that out and use it as a plug. I'll send it to Vic so they can put it on their advert board. Oh,
Yeah.
I did hear this one thing in the news the other day where
Mm,
someone, because you're talking about AI and law, that
mm,
someone tried to defend themselves with asking questions on ChatGPT, but they weren't
yeah.
allowed to. It's somewhere in America or something. Was that true?
Yeah. There was a lawyer who got caught out using ChatGPT to write their sort of just their cases for the courtroom. Um, and as far as I can tell, it just gave some really stupid answers. And the judge was rather unimpressed. The lawyer sort of claimed ignorance, said, "Oh, I didn't realize it wasn't allowed." But I mean, students use that excuse sometimes, and it doesn't convince me, so I don't think it's going to convince a judge.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I think in the legal profession, where so much of it is based on, at least in the courtroom, is based on arguments and making convincing arguments. Things like ChatGPT are not going to replace lawyers yet. But yeah, that was a particularly like facepalm example of this is someone who does not know what technology is actually doing.
Yep. All right. That was awesome. Thanks so much.
Oh, good.
For for the end, we're going to ask you a few questions. Amer, I want you to answer these as well. So I guess you guys can alternate your answers.
Oh
They're
dear.
just real like chill things, just to
Mm.
end for the last 5 minutes, kind of a wind down. So whenever you're ready, I guess you guys can pick which order you want to go in. But all right, summer or winter?
Oh, that's a hard one. Winter.
Oh, sorry, summer.
Um, all right, outdoors or indoors?
Outdoors.
Outdoors.
All right, movies or TV shows?
TV shows.
TV shows.
Uh, all right, if your life was a TV show, what genre would it be?
Horror.
I'd like some elaboration on that, Andrew. I'm curious now.
No. I like horror TV shows, and so I guess if my life had to be a TV show, I want it to be a good one that would be interesting. But I just realised now that's probably not such a good experience for me, unless I was a villain. Maybe I'll be the villain. There you go.
Sounds good. As an AI person, you probably are the villain for a few
Yeah,
people.
yeah, yeah.
Probably like a slice of life comedy for me, Aaron.
Would it be in anime form, or would it be just like
I wish it were in anime form. Oh, it'd be so much
uh,
more interesting.
all right. Well, I'll give you this then. Which superpower would you guys like to have?
Uh, Invincibility.
Invisibility
Oh
or
yeah,
or
invincibility. Can't get
invincibility?
hurt. Yeah.
Okay.
Along a similar lines, permeability, so the ability to go through stuff.
Mm.
You guys have given the most different answers. Most people usually just say like flying or transportation or teleportation or something.
Yeah.
So I like it. Just get more AI people on, get different
I
answers.
like someone's answer of being able to find a parking spot at the university.
That's
Was
unrealistic.
it's more likely that you'll be permeable than
Yeah.
finding a parking spot. In fact, yeah. Uh, cats or dogs?
Uh, I have a cat and a dog. I can't. It's like choosing a favorite child. I
But you know one's your
refuse.
favorite. You can
Uh,
refuse, but
I refuse. It's offensive.
Ah, I can't decide either. I'd say, well, dogs are far more entertaining, but I'd say my spirit animal is a domestic cat.
For- I is a hot dog a sandwich?
No.
No, we've had this debate so often. I'd still say it's a taco.
Yeah, is a
Has
taco a
to be a taco.
sandwich?
I think a taco's a taco. I think a
Yeah.
hot dog's a taco. Uh,
It's
I
about your
think
definitions, and
This
I
is
think
about
it's,
this
what's
is
a sandwich?
you're putting an AI model in here, so it's the same thing. So a Subway sub is a taco because again it's got bread or it's carbs on three sides. A
Mm.
sushi is a burrito, or burrito's a sushi, whichever way you want to look at it.
Hmm.
And empanada is a samosa.
These are all true statements.
Mm. All right. What is your least favorite type of music?
Country.
uh, EDM for me. Just don't get that noise.
All right. Last few. What is the worst thing you've paid money for?
I don't know. I haven't spent much money recently. I got some really like soggy chips from Burger King that weren't very good.
Yeah.
But ask me next time. I have to think a bit more long term.
Yeah, fair enough.
Controversial. Something from Auntie Mina's.
No. You're probably going to say your degree.
I haven't paid for it yet. Technically, the government has. I've got to pay off the loan.
Right. What's Okay, but speaking of your degree, what is something ridiculous that someone has tricked you into doing or believing?
Hmm. Yeah, I'm not good at these quick fire questions. Mayor, you go. I'll think.
There's just so many things that this the host has tricked me into believing as an as an irresponsible older brother.
Hmm.
It's,
Uh,
Oh, I got a
it's
good one. My dad convinced me that if you like when you stir a mug of Milo, if you stir backwards, it will undo it and make it separate again. And I believed it for like 5 years.
did you ever try and figure out that?
He told me I wasn't doing it right. It's like you got to do it exactly the same way you stirred it to start with.
God, that's good. Uh, All right. If you were not doing this, so your current job, what would you be doing?
Probably working for some big tech company making way too much money.
Yeah, how come you chose this then, as opposed to working for a big tech company?
Oh, that's a whole podcast in itself, I think.
Fair
oh,
enough.
surely we have him on again at this point.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. Uh,
I know. I definitely know a cohort of potential listeners who'd be very curious about that.
yeah.
First year AI students.
Yeah. Well, someone needs to teach them that they can make big money. So
That's true.
yeah, you're making multiple billionaires. If you're not one, it's fine.
And they don't even come back and give me any of it. They just
You
honestly.
need to sign. You need to sign it into the degree contract when you
Yeah, that's
sign
a
up
good
for uni.
idea. Book my lawyers.
Make sure they don't use ChatGPT.
Mm.
All right, brother. What about you?
So, synchronized swivel, maybe. Um, I'm not sure.
I've never seen you
Probably.
swim.
I'm fairly uncoordinated outside of playing cricket, so uh, maybe a connoisseur of food and media.
Unemployed.
What? Exactly. On the
Yep.
on the
Yeah,
no.
ChatGPT is taking my creativity away
All right.
in that universe.
All right. Thanks, guys. Right. The very last question. If you guys could give us one piece of advice to leave with, what would it be?
Don't do drugs. Actually, no. Don't do. Only do fun drugs that aren't too addictive.
Sounds good.
Don't do crack or like meth, but a bit of weed, bit of ecstasy. Yeah.
Sounds good. Ahmed, do you want to top that or do you want to end it on that?
I can't top that. That's actually a good plug for Bart's episode
Yeah.
on psychedelics, isn't it?
Yeah, that's good for psychedelics.
Get the right mushrooms. Don't get the wrong mushrooms. Yeah.
I,
Andrew, if you are unaware, there's a whole episode on the wrong and right type of mushrooms on this podcast, which you could listen to later
I
on.
do some professional research. Good.
Yeah. All right. Awesome. Thanks, guys, so much. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Till next time, remember, do the fun kinds of drugs.
Bye.